All right, so today's video is going to be my thoughts on power building. There's been a couple of recent videos by Natural Hypertrophy and then Bald Omni-Man. And I know Steve Shaw's made a couple posts on Instagram kind of discussing a similar topic too. So when it comes to power building, first off, I want to talk about why this is even an issue in the first place. Like, where did this come from? By the end of today's video, I'm going to talk about my definition of bodybuilding, because I think ultimately this will help solve all of this confusion between powerlifting, power building, bodybuilding, all these random terms that mean completely different things to everybody. Aside from powerlifting, we all know what that is. When it comes to power building, the reason why this had to be invented in the first place, it actually stems from enhanced bodybuilders. These are people, and I know you might be saying, where's the connection here? But these are people that a lot of the time didn't necessarily have a good understanding of how to get bigger without the enhancements, because they did the work for them. They didn't truly realize what it took to make progress in the gym. And this is still the case today with a lot of these fake natties that you see in the mainstream of the fitness industry. It's insane how this keeps sticking around, but if it's been around this long, it'll probably always be a thing. So what we have to do is build up a stronger kind of like subculture that has true definitions for these kind of things. But when it comes to making new definitions, creating new styles of training, and making things that don't have a concrete definition, we have to understand that not everybody's going to know what it is, especially if there's a lack of guidelines around something. And ultimately, when it comes to bodybuilding, that's always going to be something that doesn't have hard, concrete guidelines to follow. So you can never really just say, I'm a bodybuilder, so this is how I lift. There's one exception to that, and it's not a training method, but it is something I want to talk about at the end of the video, like I already mentioned, which is what my definition of bodybuilding is. And I think that will ultimately give us the separation between power building or powerlifting, more specifically power building in this video, and what true bodybuilding actually is. And this will, I think, just clear out some of the fog that's in everybody's perspective right now. In the meantime, I do want to talk about two different power building definitions that seem to be the most popular or held with the most respect. So when it comes to these two definitions, I see two main things floating around that both define power building. The first one, which is, to me is the most obvious and to me is the most popular, the most mainstream. Keep in mind, I do come from the more mainstream fitness community, and that's why a lot of my topics are referring to the issues with that style of training, not necessarily any issues within what our community is. I'm a product of the mainstream. I'm not a product of this natural community that we have kind of underground. Keep this in perspective too. People that follow my channel or Natural Hypertrophy or Bald Omni-Man, this is like the 1%. Sometimes we kind of forget that our community kind of is under a rock. I don't know if it'll always be that way, but it at least is for now, especially a channel like mine. Less than 20K subs. We'll get there one day, but it's still a very, very niche channel when you look at guys like these influencers that have millions of subscribers. And I don't know, totally different things. And it helps me keep things in perspective. But getting back to the point, when it comes to these definitions, the first one that I see is combining powerlifting and bodybuilding. That's the first one. This is by far the most popular definition of power building. I'm somebody that followed these approaches from these influencers in the 2016 to 2020 era. This is still very prevalent, not quite as much for sure, but it's definitely still out there, and it's still way more popular than what I would say is maybe the better usage of power building, which is this next one that both Steve Shaw and Bald Omni-Man do generally kind of refer to it as this. Don't quote this word for word, but this is generally in my perspective how they like to view it, which would be getting big and strong in every muscle group and movement pattern. This is much less common. So I think when people say power building is the way to go and they imply that definition, so I think a lot of us in this community might see that as the primary or the better way to do power building that's more effective for bodybuilding. I think we have to keep in mind that a lot of people that hear that, the word power building, will assume the first definition. One, because they either come from the mainstream, or just the term power building kind of implies you're combining powerlifting and bodybuilding, so you're doing both, not necessarily finding a happy medium between the two. So I think that's important to kind of define here. When it comes to the pros and the cons, I think the first definition of just combining powerlifting and bodybuilding, I don't think there's any pros to this from a bodybuilding perspective. You're basically just sabotaging your hypertrophy training by becoming a powerlifter and trying to do both things at once. It really doesn't make much sense at all. I don't think there's any pros, so let's just jump right into the cons of this definition. Starting off, this is the much more popular definition outside of our little community, and we have to remember that every new member to the community is coming from somewhere that isn't here, myself included. So somebody that comes to our community would refer to power building as just combining powerlifting and bodybuilding. So trying to get your 1 rep maxes as big as possible, as fast as possible, cutting any corners you need to do that. And also trying to attempt to maximize bodybuilding on the side, but usually for various reasons, this doesn't actually happen. Most people kind of get screwed over by this training method, myself included, unfortunately, and that's what spawned the start of this channel. Next bullet point here. When you combine powerlifting and bodybuilding, there ends up being a bias towards powerlifting. These people act like without powerlifting, lifters just have no direction and make no gains. They forget about things like measurements, body weight, etc. This is probably the biggest talking point that I hear for people to power build in this definition specifically, so we have to remember that. A lot of people like to act that if you don't have a concrete 1 rep max set that you want to hit, you just have no direction and you're never going to make gains. This is what was implied towards me when I did make the transition to power building. You would have certain influencers or certain people act like, all right, well, if you're not forcing progressive overload into your training by any means necessary, and you don't have strength standards that you are trying to hit, again, by any means necessary, you're directionless and you're not going to make progress. Bodybuilding's just fluff and pump. You're just going to spin your wheels forever. The only way to get big as a natural is just to get strong. This is very flawed. It's a very flawed way of thinking. And I'm not going to necessarily hold that against people. If that was the best advice they could give at the time, so be it. That's fine. But when you speak in absolute authority in something that, if you truly think about it critically and logically, doesn't add up that well, I do have an issue with that. That's exactly what I'm trying to do with my channel, is talk about what bodybuilding actually is and why bodybuilding is better than power building or powerlifting for putting on the size. The next point I've got here, the obsession and incentives to increase your 1 rep max overrides the initial desire of a bodybuilder, which is to get big. And of course, this is psychological, so this isn't a tangible thing we can apply across the board. But in my experience in the power building community, in my experience, especially in the mainstream power building, you get a lot of guys that start off in the gym to get big. And this is me, for example. I didn't care at all about lifting. I just wanted to get big. I wasn't the smartest kid. I didn't know much because I was a beginner lifter. I just didn't know that much. I didn't have that much experience. But when it comes to power building, what this mindset does is it replaces that desire and that passion to get as big as possible with the desire to get the biggest 1 rep max possible in the squat, bench, and deadlift. And when you attach your reward, you attach your incentive to getting the highest 1 rep max you possibly can in your squat, bench, or deadlift, you lose your desire to get as big as possible, because that's a slower thing. It's not as exciting on a concrete level, especially when your program incentivizes you otherwise. When your program incentivizes you to cut corners to get the biggest 1 rep max you possibly can and pursue these powerlifting goals, you start to lose your drive. You only have so much capacity to have so many goals at once. And when you either water down that drive to get big, or you just lose it entirely to an entirely different goal, You might be saying, well, you'll get kind of big when you're powerlifting, and who cares if you're having fun and you're chasing numbers and it keeps you consistent, who cares? Well, at the end of the day, why are you in the gym in the first place? It's to fulfill an innate desire that you had to get big, and you just lost it. So what are you doing now? I'm not going to say you're wasting your time, because I think powerlifting, generally speaking, is a healthy hobby to do for most people within certain boundaries, of course. But the entire reason that you started is now gone. That's a huge issue. That messed me up for a long time. And you might think I'm making an extreme example here. Maybe it is extreme, but why did I get so many followers when I started the channel of people that were in the same boat as me? I don't have a huge channel by any means, but clearly people relate to what I talk about. I'm not alone in this. I'm not the only guy that's just someone that's a normal dude that got subpar results and ruined my psychological well-being with lifting by chasing this flawed method that stole what I wanted and replaced it with something I didn't care about. And I took a long time away from lifting for it. I took 6 months entirely off, which for me is absurd. And even then, it took me forever to get back my passion for bodybuilding, because it was still being overridden through another pursuit. And it was not a good spot to be in. And it took me a really long time, even till from when I started the channel, to get that initial drive back. And I'm happy to say that I'm there now, but imagine how great my physique would be if I never lost that desire in the first place. So for me personally, it's an issue. And I think we have to have proper definitions, and I think we have to respect bodybuilding for what it is. And I think we have to have people willing to put in the work to truly resurrect what bodybuilding is, especially naturally. It's not powerlifting, it's not fluff and pump work either, and it's not just getting strong by any means necessary. There's a happy medium, and bodybuilding it's simple at first glance, but it's so complex the more you think about it. And there's just so many variables that go into it. And I hate seeing people be so lazy towards the definition of what bodybuilding is and completely disrespecting it. You have so many people that are just so lazy with it. Like, you get powerlifters that just say, oh, bodybuilding's fluff and pump work. And then you get people that are just nihilistic about bodybuilding, think you can't get big. Oh, the only way to get big naturally is just to get strong. And then you end up being a powerlifter or power builder. It's like, who's going to put in the work to actually learn what bodybuilding is and help teach that to others? I'm doing the best I can right now, and I have been for the past 1.5 to 2 years at this point. I'm not perfect. I'm not the smartest guy, obviously. I don't have the best advice in the world, but I feel like I'm doing a lot of work to help revive what natural bodybuilding truly is and what methods really make it work. And I'm showing you firsthand. If you look at my physique from when I first started the channel to my physique now, I've made crazy progress. This is my 7th year of lifting. Like, I'm trying to show you guys firsthand that this stuff works, and there's more to natural bodybuilding than just fluff and pump work. There's more to it than just get stronger, just maximize strength at any means necessary. There's more to it. So let's move on to my final bullet point for here. So the big 3 lifts, when optimized for powerlifting, are truly limiting your muscular gains. Stimulus to fatigue gets memed, but it's 100% a real issue, especially for stronger guys. And I experienced this firsthand, where I had these big fat numbers of the big 3, especially at a relatively light body weight. Keep in mind, I was 182 pounds when I was hitting all these numbers. Stimulus to fatigue is a legit thing at that point. It's truly a concern that you have to take into consideration. Sure, the meme of the guy that's been lifting for 6 months worrying about stimulus to fatigue is somewhat valid. There is some validity to it. And I'm not saying that stimulus to fatigue is just non-existent if you're not an advanced lifter or late intermediate or anything. But at the same time, sure, there's some substance to that meme for sure, is what I'm trying to say. But if you don't understand that stimulus to fatigue is an actual concept to take seriously, especially as you get strong, it becomes an issue. And guess what? If you have a bunch of lifts in your program where you're maximizing your performance on paper, you are going to be more fatigued and you're going to be able to handle less work than if you're trying to maximize hypertrophy stimulus in the target muscle. That's where you start to see these tiny little details and these little aspects of programming and training. They start to accumulate and they start to add up and they start to actually make a pretty big difference in the mid to long term, especially as you become stronger and or bigger. So those are all things to take into consideration. The second definition, this is the more niche definition. And just as a refresher, since I've been talking for a bit now, getting big and strong in every muscle group and movement pattern. So basically just trying to get as big and as strong as you possibly can across the board in every muscle and every lift that you have in your program. So this is getting much closer to what bodybuilding is. There's still a few flaws. Did I say that right? Did I say flaws? I don't know. Maybe I'm just overthinking this one. But either way, I think there are a few flaws with this approach. I do think it's a very good approach overall, and you will certainly get big and jacked doing this, but there are a couple things to keep in mind if you do take this approach. This seems to be a very niche definition, and this is somewhat similar to how I see Steve Shaw and Bald Omni-Man define power building. And keep in mind, I don't think they're defining power building as the ultimate way to get as big as possible purely for hypertrophy. I think this is a happy medium between being able to go beast mode and be super strong and maximize your size gains in that pursuit. So I don't think this is what these guys are saying as the best possible way to get as big as possible. So I would refer to this as closer to, or just as, general strength training rather than power building. Power building is a word that combines powerlifting and bodybuilding, so this assumes you're aiming to maximize both endeavors, whether competitively or recreationally. I think a lot of people put a little bit too much weight on if you compete or if you just do it recreationally. I don't see that as too big of a deciding factor for these definitions. So when a lifter is told power building is a viable option to maximize size gains, this is where people get confused. So I'd argue that the second option is the more viable option, but I think the word power building doesn't make as much sense. And I think a lot of people that have less experience and do come from the mainstream, don't understand this to be power building. When they hear power building, they think of the mainstream version, which I do think is the more instinctive version of it anyways, just combining two things into one, not trying to take the best aspects of both and make a new entire training method. So when it comes to this, my final bullet point here, the only potential issue with this approach is truly technique. Maximizing performance on paper and maximizing growth stimulus internally are two different things, although there is going to be crossover. So when you take this approach, the thing that I love about it and the thing that makes so much sense and the mindset that I love about this is you're maximizing every muscle group. The movement patterns thing, yeah, sure, that's of course going to be correlated with the muscle groups you're trying to target. If you get strong in every movement pattern, every muscle group is generally going to be hit pretty well through that. But I do like to focus more on the muscles themselves for a couple different reasons. It's not a topic worth talking about for this one. But this is a stepping stone to actually fixing your powerlifting mindset. What this can do, if you're coming from being brainwashed into power building in the first definition, or just straight up powerlifting as someone that truly cares about hypertrophy, this is a training method that teaches you to take that reward that you get from powerlifting that's still stuck in your brain and maximize that and almost use that as leverage to maximize every muscle group in your body through trying to maximize every movement pattern that you have in your program. So with this, your arm training, your calf raises, your isolation movements, your machine compound lifts, anything outside the big three, you have that incentive to maximize your effort levels on that lift. That's not all there is to bodybuilding, but it's a really good first step. And I would say this is still a really good way to get super jacked. It's not the best way, in my opinion, because of the whole technique thing, which I'll touch on in a second, but this is a very viable way to get big, and this is 10 times out of 10 better than the first definition of power building. It just leaves one little thing on the table that I do think is somewhat important, especially as you become stronger and or bigger. which is technique. So this is where the main problem with this approach for pure bodybuilding results lies, in my opinion. If you're trying to get as strong as you possibly can on a movement, you're bound to cut corners because you have to. Your performance on paper isn't maximized when you're training for hypertrophy. And the reason for that is because you go for a full range of motion. And if you say, well, get strong with a full range of motion, sure. Well, then you can just speed up your tempo, and that's still an issue. So if I was to do as many reps on preacher curls as I possibly could and give my best performance possible, I could probably hit like 105 pounds for 6 reps or something. I'm not really sure, but it's something like that. What I'm trying to say is there's a buffer room between what you're doing in the gym and what your true maximum performance is, even if you're training to failure or 0 reps in reserve. And the reason for that is because you're milking more stimulus out of each rep earlier in the set, so you fail it a little bit sooner. When you take something like a preacher curl, if I was just to drop the eccentric and then curl up and even use a little bit of cheat with my shoulders and my elbows or something like that, that doesn't mean it's the most stimulative set I can do, even though on paper it's the most performant. So the best thing I could do is control the eccentric, and I'm not telling you to do 5-second, like stupidly slow controlled eccentrics. I think that's also ridiculous too. But even if I'm just controlling it for 1 or 2 seconds, I'm going to fail 3 or 4 reps earlier with 5 or 10 less pounds on the bar than I would if I was just to maximize my tempo, to kind of bounce the weight or just not use as much energy on something like an eccentric, which when you're tracking reps, an eccentric doesn't count. We only count concentrics. And that's another reason why people don't take the eccentric seriously and they just drop it. They say, oh, well, more weight means more growth. So if I bounce the bar off my chest or if I skip the eccentric, that's saving me energy to put more effort into my concentrics and get more reps and or use more weight. Progressive overload also causes growth, right? This is another flawed mindset where, all right, if I did 8 reps, that's 8 reps with 90 pounds, decent stimulus. I have to get 9. Who knows when I'm actually going to get 9 with the same technique, but I know for a fact that for myself personally, if...
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
No. What? What are you doing, Siri? Sorry, guys. Siri's interrupting me. And it's 22.5 minutes, and I haven't needed to edit this video, so I'm going to leave Siri in. I don't know where she came from, but what was I saying? So 90 pounds with preacher curls. Let's say I get 8 reps on this, and my mindset is progressive overload causes growth. Then I would do 9 reps by all means necessary. Next week I'd do 10. But if I was maintaining my technique and trying to maximize stimulus from that set, maybe I don't get that 9th rep until 2 or 3 weeks from now. And ironically, that is what would get me the better growth if I was just patient and let that 9th rep come naturally while I was maximizing my technique and maximizing my stimulus. Because once you start chasing performance on paper on every single lift, it's a matter of weeks before your technique degrades and you're maximizing performance on paper in your program. You feel good about it and whatnot. But if you were to actually hold yourself accountable by looking at your technique and or filming your sets, you'd realize that you're just removing that buffer room that should have been there in the first place. And you might be saying, well, if I'm just getting as strong as I possibly can, that's still going to get me big, right? Yeah, to a degree. But one, it might not be maximizing the actual stimulus that you're getting from the set. And 2, it's certainly not giving you more stimulus. So even if the stimulus is equal, you're building up more fatigue through training like this. And is this nitpicky? Is it a big deal? I don't know. It's probably somewhere in between. But on certain lifts, this is a big deal, especially lifts that have a lot of fatigue, or especially lifts that could give a lot of stimulus that you aren't getting that stimulus from, especially by not controlling the eccentrics, for example. So when it comes to that buffer room and whether this is a big deal or not, this is ultimately where the definition of true bodybuilding lies, in my opinion. So I told you guys I'd give you my definition of what bodybuilding is. Let me go ahead and do that for you. So first off, about bodybuilding. What about it? Like, what happened to bodybuilding? It's not even a thing. Like, we're trying to tell people that power building or powerlifting is the way to go to get as big as you possibly can. Bodybuilders have never been able to hold up a good definition of how to get big. And the reason for that is because you can do it in a bunch of different ways. So yeah, there's been a lot of people that don't understand bodybuilding that look super big because they're on drugs, and then we take their advice, realize it doesn't work, and then it leads to all this confusion. But at the same time, there's a whole other element of confusion because you can do it however you want, and you're not competing within a specific confine. It's just about your physique, which you can build in any way possible, whether that's calisthenics, whether that's with drugs, whether that's with powerlifting, or whatever bodybuilding pursuit that you want to take that you believe in the gym. So how do we define bodybuilding? In my opinion, and this is my definition of bodybuilding that I personally came up with, bodybuilding is training in a fashion that prioritizes and aims to maximize hypertrophy stimulus above all else. And I think that's the right definition to take for bodybuilding, because when you take power building, that second definition we talked about, it's very close, but it's not quite there because you're still aiming to maximize performance at the expense of either some stimulus or at the expense of adding a little bit more fatigue. We can debate how nitpicky that is or how big of a deal that is another time. All I know is that it is a factor. It's just a matter of the magnitude of that factor. But I think if it is a variable, it is worth taking into consideration and even having an entirely separate definition for this. So power building definition 1, that's an abomination, as natural hypertrophy would say. I completely and wholeheartedly agree with him on that. This isn't a response video to either of these guys, by the way. This is just me expanding my thoughts because, come on, this is my niche. This is my cup of tea. So that's a very bad method of training, what I defined first and what natural hypertrophy is discussing in his video. The second definition is close. It's very close. And I think this is a much better way to view power building. And for people that want to get big as they possibly can within a certain training protocol that also maximizes general strength, this is 100% the way to go. So if you like to toss around weight, have strength goals, and have strength standards that you want to hit, and you also want to be jacked, 100% a way to go. But if you're someone like me that doesn't actually care about the lift themselves outside of using it for a performance indicator that helps you measure growth, going for my definition of bodybuilding is ultimately the way to go. So when I give out, in my opinion, I'm by no means saying I'm the best or anything like that. This is just my opinion. So when I give out advice on this channel for bodybuilding, it's under that definition, and it always has been. So with that being said, that's all I've got for today. I will see you guys in the next one.